This returns 2,650 precincts out of 2,987 in the city of Chicago. Give Thompson 250,887. Lyle 200,386. Alberts 87,782. Smith 10,054, which indicate with the remaining precincts we will have won a victory of 60,000 plurality.
In the history of American cities, few politicians are as colorful or as contradictory as William Hale Big Bill Thompson. He was a populist hero and a political showman. He was an effective political machine leader and a master of public spectacle. And for all his grand plans for Chicago, history would ultimately remember him for one thing: his open alliance with America's most famous gangster, Al Capone. This is the story of Big Bill Thompson, the last Republican to be mayor of Chicago, and arguably one of the most unethical mayors in American history. Well, welcome back to James on the Mob. I'm James Jenkins, host and narrator. In this episode, we go to City Hall. They called him Big Bill, a 6-foot swaggering showman who once debated 2 rats on stage and let gangsters run wild in City Hall. We covered the story of William Hale Thompson, from Tin Horn Cowboy to Crooked Mayor, from Big Bill the Builder to Kaiser Bill, all as the citizens of Chicago laughed and cried while open violence and corruption reached unprecedented levels in a city that brags that it supposedly works. But for who? William Hale Thompson was born in Boston, Massachusetts on May 14, 1869. But his connection to Chicago began almost immediately, with his family relocating to the city when he was just 9 days old. He was not a self-made man, but rather the result of a prominent Chicago family. His father, William Hale Thompson Sr., was a wealthy real estate operator and a respected figure in the city, having served as a colonel in the 2nd Illinois Guard and in the United States Navy. Thompson's maternal grandfather, Stephen F. Gale, was also notable as a Chicago pioneer and the city's first fire chief. Thompson's privileged upbringing, however, was interrupted by a formative and unconventional period in his youth. At the age of 14, instead of attending Yale as his family had intended, Thompson chose a radically different path. He made a deal with his father where he would spend winters in Chicago going to school and the rest of the year out west to Wyoming to become a cowboy and cattle owner. This period of his life also saw him travel to Europe and later take up ranching in New Mexico and Texas. By his early 20s, he had managed to accumulate a personal stake of $30,000. This biographical detail would later become a cornerstone of his political identity. And following his father's death in 1891, he returned to Chicago in 1892 to manage the family's estate. His time in the American West was not just a youthful adventure, it was a carefully cultivated part of his political brand, allowing him to project an image of an authentic, rugged individualist who was distinct from the traditional urban elite. This manufactured authenticity, symbolized by Western touches he incorporated into his campaigns, and his use of a sombrero as a campaign emblem, was a fundamental element of his political showmanship, enabling him to connect with voters in a way that his privileged background alone could not. Thompson's political career began in 1900 when the Municipal Voters League, a nonpartisan reform group, sought out a suitable candidate to run for alderman of the city's 2nd Ward. Thompson, with no real interest in politics, had agreed to run as a Republican to win a $50 bet with a fellow member of the Chicago Athletic Club. With his election as alderman for the city's 2nd Ward, an area with a large black population, whose votes he would later secure in his quest for mayor, Thompson found that he enjoyed politics and equaled it to a showdown at the OK Corral without the bloodshed. At the time, the chairman of the group that sponsored his election was quoted as saying, "The worst thing you can say about Bill is that he's stupid." His tenure as alderman was a bit of a disaster, as although he did introduce a bill that established the city's first playground, he allowed himself to be hoodwinked by his neighboring aldermen in the 1st Ward, the notorious duo of Michael Bathhouse John Coughlin and Michael Hinky Dink Kenna, to redistrict the 2nd Ward almost off the map in order to extend their power over the city's vice district. In fact, when the redistricting was done, Thompson, 2nd Ward Alderman, was living in the 1st Ward. Thompson served in this role until 1902 and was subsequently elected to the Cook County Board of Commissioners, where he served until 1904. During this period, Thompson began to build his political network, forming an alliance with William Lorimer, known as the Blonde Boss, who would be expelled as a U.S. Senator in 1912, and Frederick London, a city clerk. Both of these men known for their corrupt election methods. These early positions allowed Thompson to hone the political skills, alliances, and the buffoonery that would eventually lead him to the city's highest office. Thompson's first term as mayor began in 1915, and he immediately earned a new nickname, Big Bill the Builder. His administration oversaw major public works projects, including the completion of the Michigan Avenue Link Bridge, the opening of Navy Pier, and the widening of 12th Street and Ogden Avenue. But Thompson's political method was built on spectacle and manufactured conflict. He positioned himself as a champion of the people, fighting for populist causes like a 5-cent streetcar fare and suing the L, Chicago's elevated train public transportation system, to prevent a fare increase after World War I. His strategy was to constantly be at war with vague, faked enemies, most famously the Chicago Tribune. This press baiting was a calculated diversion, ensuring the public's attention was fixed on the drama, while his administration engaged in behind-the-scenes patronage and graft. In 1915, a delegation of civic-oriented women urged Thompson to appoint a well-qualified woman to the city's new Office of Commissioner of Public Welfare. Thompson did appoint a woman. However, instead of a woman qualified by a public welfare background, he appointed Louise Osborne Rowe, a Republican Party worker and loyalist. Within a year of her appointment, Rowe was charged with operating a kickback scheme in the department and was forced to resign in 1916. This post would remain vacant until the administration of Thompson's successor. This strategy reached its peak during World War I. While other leaders rallied for war, Thompson adopted an isolationist and anti-British stance. He even made a notorious promise to punch the monarch, King George V, in the snoot. He declined to allow the visit of the French mission to Chicago and refused to control or act against anti-war, anti-conscription meetings. Thompson is credited with characterizing Chicago as the 6th German city of the world. Critics called him Kaiser Bill and accused him of making the city and himself an international laughingstock. But the move was a masterclass in ethnic politics, consolidating his support among Chicago's large German and Irish populations. The most profound tragedy of Thompson's tenure was the Chicago race riot of 1919. The violence erupted on July 27, 1919, after an African-American teenager, Eugene Williams, drowned in Lake Michigan after being stoned by a group of white youths for crossing an unofficial segregated swimming line. The tensions were exacerbated when a white police officer refused to arrest the stone thrower, instead arresting an African-American man, which triggered days of widespread violence. Thompson's response was a game of brinksmanship with Illinois Governor Frank Loudon, as he initially refused to request the deployment of the Illinois Army National Guard for 4 days, despite the troops being ready in Chicago's armories. This delay allowed the violence to escalate, resulting in 38 deaths, 23 black, 15 white, over 500 injuries, and more than 1,000 homes destroyed. In the aftermath, Thompson's administration proposed a racial code of ethics and boundaries for communities, an action that, while appearing to be a solution, also served to entrench segregation. He even used this association with the riot as a talking point later in political campaigns. Thompson declined to run for re-election in 1923, and he was succeeded by William Emmett Deaver. While out of office, Thompson was appointed chairman of the Illinois Waterways Commission. He used his position to remain relevant in the media, involving himself in civic suits and campaigning for the Lakes to Gulf Waterway Project, to build a waterway from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Promoting both the project and himself, Thompson set off on a scientific expedition extensively covered by the media, which he allegedly set off to the South Seas in order to find a tree-climbing fish. Attracting more attention, Thompson placed a $25,000 bet on his success, but no one participated. And Thompson abandoned the expedition midway to New Orleans, the expedition having served its purpose as a publicity stunt. And after a break from politics in the mid-1920s, Thompson made a triumphant return in 1927, facing off against the incumbent mayor, William E. Deaver. Deaver had cracked down on prohibition hard, maybe too hard, upsetting ethnic blocs who saw nothing wrong in a little drink every now and then, and forcing gangsters into the suburbs. Thompson, ever the opportunist, saw his chance. His campaign was a theatrical circus with stunts like a public debate with live rats he claimed represented his enemies. But his real strategy was far more sinister. Thompson ran on a strongly wet platform, promising the end of enforcement of prohibition and even vowing to fire every cop who attempts to enter your home and in search of a still or for a bottle of liquor. Even before the height of Al Capone's reign, Thompson's administration had been mired in allegations of graft. The fact that he was investigated for fraud in 1923, where his political handler, Fred London, was convicted for graft, led him not to seek re-election that year, further substantiates that his reputation for corruption was not a later development, but an ongoing issue throughout his early tenure. Thompson's first 2 terms coincided with the very period when Chicago's criminal underworld was reorganizing itself in response to the dawning of the Prohibition era. As one source notes, Chicago was already a hard-drinking town where political corruption allowed the illegal liquor trade to run rampant. This environment provided a fertile breeding ground for ambitious gangsters. In 1919, in the middle of Thompson's second term, mobster Johnny Torrio brought a young Al Capone to Chicago to work for local vice lord Big Jim Colosimo. When Colosimo was allegedly murdered by Torrio for standing in the way of bootlegging, a major power vacuum was created. Thompson's administration did not or could not control this escalating violence, creating a law enforcement void that Capone and others would soon exploit. Thompson's subsequent and more explicit alliance with Capone in his third term was therefore not a sudden betrayal, but rather the culmination of a preliminary era of corruption and permissiveness he had already set in motion during his first 2 terms. This was the public side of an unholy alliance. In exchange for this political protection, Al Capone's organization provided Thompson's campaign with a massive financial contribution, estimated to be anywhere from $100,000 to $500,000. Some reports cite a specific donation of $260,000. It was public knowledge that Capone's men were collecting money for the Thompson campaign. This was not a backroom deal. It was an open, mutually beneficial partnership. The consequences were immediate and violent. The April 10, 1928 Pineapple primary saw Capone's organization using bombings and intimidation to ensure Thompson's supporters won. At least 15 people were killed, and the violence ushered in a far more serious level of violence and graft into Chicago politics. Thompson, for his part, publicly dismissed gangster activity as just, newspaper talk. The relationship was complete. Thompson provided the political cover, and Capone provided the muscle and the money. Then, there was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. On Valentine's Day 1929, the long simmering gang war between Capone and his Northside rival, George Bugs Moran, boiled over. Dressed as police officers, 4 of Capone's hitmen entered a garage at 2122 North Clark Street, a known hangout for Moran's crew. They lined 7 men against the wall under the pretense of a raid, and then, with no warning, opened fire with submachine guns and shotguns. The victims were riddled with bullets, a savage act so brazen it shocked the entire nation. Moran, the intended target, was miraculously late and survived. The crime itself was a masterclass in brutality, a meticulous, merciless act of gangland warfare. The Thompson-Capone alliance and the St. Valentine's Day Massacre would ultimately prove to be Big Bill's downfall, as well as Capone's. His spectacular defeat in 1931 to Democrat Anton Cermak brought an end to an era of Republican rule and set the stage for the new unified Democratic machine that would define Chicago politics for generations. In 1936, Thompson ran for the office of Illinois governor on the Union Progressive ballot line against Democratic incumbent Henry Horner and Republican nominee C. Wayland Brooks. He received only 3% of the vote. In 1939, Thompson ran in the Republican primary for mayor of Chicago and was soundly defeated by future Governor Dwight Green. After these losses, he would retreat from public life, and he died of pneumonia in his suite at the Blackstone Hotel in Chicago on March 19, 1944, at the age of 74. But Thompson had one final surprise for the city. After his death, authorities opened 2 safe deposit boxes in his name. Inside, they found over $1.8 million in cash and bonds, an amount equivalent to over $28 million today. While his lawyer insisted the money came from shrewd stock sales, the public and the media saw it as definitive proof of decades of corruption and bribery. So goes the story of Big Bill Thompson. The Chicago Tribune's postmortem editorial captured the city's final damning judgment, declaring that Thompson meant filth, corruption, obscenity, idiocy, and bankruptcy for Chicago. Big Bill Thompson, the master of image, ultimately had his true legacy revealed in a safe deposit box, a final, unshakable record of his corruption. And in the comments below, let me know if you think that you see any parallels with Thompson and his administration and present-day politics. I'm James Jenkins. If you've enjoyed this video and like to see more like this one, hit that like button, subscribe, share, and stay tuned for another episode of James on the Mob. And remember, life is short, so don't whack it off. See yas.